Hello, this is PIC Computing, BTEC Level 3, video number 12, looking at programming and iteration. Iteration is a key part of programming. We might also know iteration as looping, and once you've cracked loops, you'll feel that you really are starting to crack programming. Loops are such an important part of making efficient and maintainable programs. A good definition of iteration might be: iteration makes a group of statements execute more than one time and automatically. It's useful because it saves having to write out the same statement multiple and possibly many times. There are two main types of loop. There's the count control loops, such as for loops, and then there are condition control loops, such as while loops and repeat until loops. The first type of loop we're going to look at is the count controlled one, the for loop. So I've got my VB.NET program here, and on the form I've got a bunch of buttons that will test out some different sorts of loops for us. So I've got a button for for loop, and if I double click on that, I'll see the code that will execute, but I've put a breakpoint on it just like last video so we can see what happens as we step through it. As in the last video, which I didn't mention very much, we've got things called variables, which just help our program move along. Variables are places in memory that are reserved for storing values, and most programming languages need them and use them. So we've used a couple here. We've used one for which is basically the count on our loop, how many times we've looped around, and I've just got one for building up a message. So that's what they're about. So let's run it and see what happens with this for loop. Click on the button. My code's going to stop here. I use F11 in this version of VB.NET to step through it. And what it's saying is, for the variable BT loop, which is currently 0, because when you declare a number variable, it starts off at 0, unless you set it to something different. For BT loop equaling 1 to 10, put the value of BT loop into SMessage. So the first time I hit it, F11, BT loop is going to be 1, because we're doing it for 1 to 10. So BT loop 1 is going to go as part of our message. So I hit F11 again, and it says next. And when it hits next, it goes back to the top of the loop, and then it does the next value in the loop. So now BT loop is 2. It's the second time round. So SMessage will have added 2 added into it. So if I hover over SMessage now, we can see that SMessage is actually 1 space 2, because we've gone around the loop twice. And if we do it again, this time it's going to add 3 onto it. So with one line of code inside that loop there, we're actually repeating the statement however many times the loop's going round. Now I'm just going to put another breakpoint on my message box there, and I'm actually going to hit F5 this time. So it's gone around the loop 10 times, and you can see there SMessage has got the value each time the loop's gone round. So if I hit F11 now, we should see my message come up. There we go, and we've got 10 values printed out there in that message box, even though we've only got really 3 lines of code that have done it. So that's avoided doing SMessage equals SMessage and 1, SMessage equals SMessage and 2, all the way up to 10. We've only had to use 3 lines of code. And if we wanted to do it 1,000 times, we'd still only need the 3 lines of code. So extremely useful, and becomes more useful when we do things like connect up our VB.NET programs to a database, but we'll look at that more in a future video. So that's the for loop. It uses a variable to decide whether the instructions should be repeated. The variable is given start and end values, as we saw. The first time the loop is executed, the variable is equal to the starting value. When the code gets to the end of the first execution of the loop and arrives at the next statement, the variable is incremented and the loop starts again. So we saw that, first of all, the loop was at 1, and then we got to the next statement, and when it went back up to the top, it was gone to 2. So it increments each time it hits the next statement. This repeats until the variable reaches the end value, which was 10 in our case, and at this point the loop executes one last time. So there's the construct, which you might want to try and memorize, as with that definition there. So all of those bullet points will be good to remember when it comes to for loops. Now we'll look at condition control loops. These are used when we don't know how many times we want instructions in a loop to be repeated. So if we think about our for loop that we just did, because we said for loop 1 to 10, we knew that we wanted the loop to execute those 10 times. But often in programming, particularly when you're retrieving a bunch of records from a database, we don't know how many records are in that record set that goes to the VB.NET program. We need to use condition control loops. But they're useful in other places as well. There are two main types. There's while loops and repeat until loops. So we'll look at while loops first of all. In while loops, the condition is tested first. You'll see what we mean with that in a moment. If the condition is true, then instructions inside the loop are executed. Code jumps back up to the top of the loop after the instructions have been executed, and the condition at the top of the loop is tested again. This continues until the condition is tested as false. If the condition is tested as false, then the code jumps after the loop and the rest of the code underneath the loop is executed. So the construct might look like this. While the condition is true, execute the instructions, and then go back up to the top of the loop and check that condition again. If it's still true, execute the instructions, jump back up to the top. Now if the condition is false for any reason, we end the loop. So let's see that in action. So I've got two buttons to demonstrate the while loop here for you. So double click on that one, make sure my breakpoint's on. It is. And let's give it a whirl. So this is going to do the same as my for loop, but a different way. So we've got variables again, and we're setting the BT loop variable to be 1, and we're saying whilst BT loop is less than 11, populate that sMessage variable again with whatever the value of the loop is, and then increment that loop by 1 each time. So if we move through it, BT loop is 1 at the moment, and when it gets to the end, where it says loop there, it's just going back up to the top again, and because BT loop is still less than 11, that means the condition is true. So it keeps whirring round, populating our sMessage variable. So up to 5 there at the moment. So 6, 7, 8. 8 now. 9. 10. Now when it gets around this time, we're on loop at the bottom here. It's going to go back up to do while BT loop is now 11, which isn't less than 11. Therefore the condition is false, so it shouldn't go down onto the next 2 lines now. It doesn't. It jumps down underneath the loop. The loop has finished. We can display our results, which are the same as what they were for the for loop. So that's a very simple use of the while loop there. A more likely use of the while loop might be my second example, where it's asking me to actually enter something variable at the beginning. So if I enter the number 2 into here, and we'll see what the code does. So I've captured that number 2 in an input box and assigned it to the iTotal variable. And what the while loop asks this time is while iTotal is less than or equal to 100, basically make iTotal itself times by itself. So it's going to increase a lot each time. So depending on the number first entered, the loop is going to execute a variable amount of times depending on what was first entered. So a while loop testing a condition is necessary. So it's currently 2. This time it's going to be 4, of course, because 2 times 2 is 4, and that goes into the message box. And then this time we're going to come out with 16, because 4 times 4 is 16. We do. Now this time, 16 times 16 is 256. So it's going to add that to the smessage variable. But this time, when it's testing out, 256 is not less than or equal to 100, so it's going to jump after the loop. The loop is not needed anymore. Notice they used end while on the loop this time, whereas before we used loop. I don't think it makes any difference. So if we just bring up the message now, we can see it went 4, 16, 2, 5, 6, so it looped 3 times. But if I put in a higher number, say I put in 12, then the loop is not going to go around too many times. I think did it go down round once there? You'd expect that, wouldn't you? Because 12 times 12 is 144, so the second time it hits that top condition, it's saying false, so the loop only executed once on that occasion. So that's the while loop. So the other type of condition control loop is the repeat until loops, and a repeat until loop will do a very similar job to the while loop, but we'll do it in a different fashion, and you'll see. With a repeat until loop, instructions inside the loop are executed first before the condition is tested. At the end of the loop, the condition is tested. If the condition is false, the instructions inside the loop are executed again. This continues until the condition at the end of the loop is tested as true. At this point, code jumps after the loop, and the rest of the code underneath the loop is executed. So the check happens at the end of the loop, and it's back to front really compared to the while loop. Not just because the check is done at the end of the loop, but because we're looking for a condition to be false for the loop to continue, and once the condition is true, the loop ends. So there's the construct. Check comes at the end after instructions have been executed. So let's see this one in action. Got my breakpoint on ready. Going to put in my number, so it does the same thing as the previous program, or almost. 2 goes into the iTotal variable, and you'll notice that in VB.NET it's not called a repeat until loop. You've got to use the do loop, and at the end it says loop until. So it does the same job, it's just worded differently. So iTotal starts off as 2, and then the check is done. So if iTotal is 4, because it's times by itself up here, loop until 4 is greater, iTotal is greater or equal than 100. Well, it's currently 4, so that means that the condition is false, so the loop fires again. So this time it's going to be 16. So again, that's false, so it fires again. This time it's going to be 256, but it adds the 256 into our message string for 16256. This time, when it hits that check at the bottom of the loop, 256 is greater than or equal to 100. Therefore, the check is true, so the loop ends, and we get our message at the end there. So a different way of looping round using a condition is the repeat until loop. One thing you're going to need to know about as well is something called nested loops. Now in the last video we saw that selection constructs could be nested within one another, so you could have an if statement inside of an if statement. Well, the same thing can happen with loops. Loops can also be nested within one another, so you can have a loop inside a loop. Loops can be nested inside conditions, so you could have a loop inside an if statement, and conditions can be nested inside loops, so you could have an if statement or a select case inside a loop as well. So if we have a look at a couple of quick examples of that, I have code here for the button that says for loop with an if statement. I've got a loop happening here 10 times, and inside each time the code loops around, there's a check done on it with an if then else statement, and it's just a basic bit of maths really that checks if a number is even or odd. So the first time it's going to be odd, second time it's going to be even. So I'm not going to step through that, but you'll see the effect that it has. Sorry, wrong button. We're going to have to start it again. For loop with if statement, F5 it, and basically it's just telling me with that small amount of code which numbers are odd and which are even from 1 to 10. And then I've got another one a bit further down, which is basically going to loop around 10 times, but for each time it loops in that loop, it's going to loop another 10 times to give me some decimal placed numbers, and you'll see exactly what this one does there. So for the number 1, it's giving me each value in the range 1 to 10 as like a decimal, and then the same for 2, 3, all the way down to 10. So generated a lot of patterns of data there with a very small amount of code. That's iteration, and that's loops for you. See you next time.